All right, so welcome everybody. I really appreciate you being here. I understand if you need to step away and come back, it's no problem. We'll take a break halfway through our 2-hour training today. So this training is really kind of a foundational training for corrections officers and jail staff, and our topics are going to be trauma, stress, and resilience. So I'm going to talk about stress. I'll talk about trauma and what is the difference between stress and trauma, and then I'll talk about resilience. And I'll talk about specific strategies and the 6 different areas of resilience that are important for you to be aware of. So I'm Marie Ridgway. I'm sure you all have heard of me and us by now. I have a practice in the metro area, and we are up there with you all about quarterly or more often on site. I work with about 45 law enforcement, fire, and EMS agencies. We exclusively work with first responders in Minnesota, and I'm a licensed independent clinical social worker. So me and all of my staff are master's level social workers with the clinical piece. So you're welcome to check out our website. There's bios and photos of everybody. You all have access to us with the wellness program there at Crow Wing. And I got into this work in about 2017. I previously worked at a county. I worked in child protection and on the psychiatric crisis team. So I worked alongside law enforcement, and I just have a lot of respect for your professions. I understand there's some unique pieces as well about working inside of a jail. And so I'll speak to those. Outside of work, I have 2 kids. My son is 15 and my daughter is turning 13 in a couple weeks. So a couple teenagers, and that keeps me plenty busy in addition to work. So other than that, I just try not to be a hypocrite. I do a lot of studying and research on wellness and resilience topics and brain health, and I try to put as much of that into play as I can. And I have my own areas of, strength and growth. So right there along with you with all of this. So we do lots of different training. We train peer support teams. We train on wellness. I also train other therapists in how to work with first responders and law enforcement. And ultimately, what I would love is everyone in your professions to be connected to somebody who knows how to help, someone who understands your job and the stressors that commonly go along with it, so that you always have an option to reach out to if you ever need it. I think that's only fair. I also do clinical consultation for about 5 crisis negotiation teams around Minnesota. And so clearly I love variety in my work. And it's usually a lot of fun. So Charlie, you may have met when I've come and done some introductions there. He's our therapy dog. We just finished our Canine Good Citizen certification, which was a lot of work and it was a lot of fun. The day before the test, he just bombed the practice test, and I thought, oh my gosh, we're never going to make it. And then we went in the next day and he just aced it. So that was good. And he's been a great value for our practice. So he pretty much goes wherever I go, and certainly is a good encourager of all kinds of positive resilience strategies, like taking a walk every day and and all the routines that a shepherd relies on. These are kind of big picture program goals. So, we're doing a lot of work right now in this area. And what are we aiming at? So we're aiming at helping increase your quality of life. We're helping to mitigate the common stress response, prevent long-term effects from the stress of your job. And then suicide prevention is important to us, along with connecting everybody to somebody who knows how to help. So I see here that there might be more people needing to be let back in, and I wish there was a way to just automatically let everybody in, but I'll keep an eye on that. So if I seem a little distracted, it's because I'm watching out for that. So I don't see anybody waiting right now. we're very interested in suicide prevention. It's a big passion of ours. And I will speak a little bit to that today. We really try to reduce the stigma around mental health, because when people aren't able to connect with each other, get what they need, know that there are options out there for support, sometimes when thoughts of suicide come to mind, which they can do when someone is in a lot of psychological pain, they may take hold as far as turning into any kind of plan or intention. And that's, of course, dangerous. It's tragic when it happens, especially to those of you who are helping others. And so we're really passionate about that too. I always say someone who works with law enforcement needs to be fluent in suicidality and able to talk about it very openly and honestly without shame and stigma. And that allows us to have very honest conversations with people so that we can get them what they need without overreacting and without underreacting. So that's kind of our take on that. So here's the situation for corrections staff. There are higher rates of anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, alcohol abuse, depression, suicidal thoughts, suicide itself. And these rates are not only higher than the general population, but they're actually also higher than the other types of first responders. So I think corrections is maybe not quite had as much, it certainly is not as much research from what I've been looking at as law enforcement as a whole, or the first responders as a whole. And I don't know that it's widely understood that these rates are even higher for correction staff than they are for law enforcement generally. There are a lot of contributing factors. You all know these, you live them, you work them over time, whether it's voluntary or mandatory, contributes to some of these risks. Your work, your trauma exposure, I'll explain what is trauma and the difference between trauma and stress, the length of time that you've worked in the role, actual role that you have, the level of security at the facility you work at. Unsupportive management can contribute to these risk factors. Shift work, of course, does. I'll talk about sleep and how that's so important for our brain health and our mental health, and then interpersonal conflict. And so these pieces here are from a 2019 study that I found. But like I said, I was really interested and kind of dismayed to see that there is certainly a lot more research that's needed. It's certainly behind where we're at in the other areas. We're going to talk about not just the problem today, but also some solutions and creating a supportive occupational environment is really important, not just for increased work health, but also for increased social health. So your personal and social health is very much tied into your work health. And so just across the board, there's a lot of good reasons to be focused on solutions. Employee surveys are a great way to start there. I'm the clinical consultant for the peer support team at Crow Wing County, and something that has already been done, I'm sure, and needs to be done regularly are these employee surveys, so that your input on what's going well and what do you still need and the feedback that you have to give can be taken into account, because all of these wellness program options are there for all of you. And so it certainly needs to be known how it's going and what else is needed. You've got a peer support team. I know there's somebody from kind of each area within the sheriff's office on that team, and you're able to speak to any one of those peers with confidentiality at play there. And they all have access to me for clinical consultation. So instead of any talking amongst each other, they have access to a clinician, me or any of my associates, to problem solve anything or talk through anything they might be having a challenge with related to supporting peers. So diffusings and debriefings, you may have seen these happening with peer support. Maybe they were happening before, but hopefully they're happening more often now. Anybody can ask for one of these, and the idea is to increase the amount of support you feel immediately after and following an incident, so that you have a better chance of a quick kind of bounce back after something stressful happens. It's important to have policies that support wellness and resilience, and to have training that's effective and occupationally specific, so that you know what to watch for and have some good strategies and understanding of how to take care of yourself. All right, so these are some of the options I started talking about. You all have access to us. You have 6 sessions per year that are employer paid. They're confidential, so we bill with just a code. The agencies we work with don't ever know who we're billing for. And then we don't diagnose, so we don't have to. We're not billing insurance. When you bill insurance, that's when it needs to be medically necessary. And so we don't have to kind of prove that with a diagnosis when we're able to bill employers. So I know that that can be an understandable barrier. People may not want a label like that. For others, they sort of ask, like, what's going on? What explains what I'm experiencing here? And we're certainly able to diagnose, but it isn't something that we have to regularly practice. Everybody's going to have check-ins. The patrol and investigations and admin on the sheriff's office side had theirs this year, and then it sounds like it'll be including corrections officers next year. And so I'll talk to you in a bit here about what those are, what to expect. I want to answer any questions you might have, and hopefully I'll get ahead of those by telling you really what to expect, what it is and what it isn't, and how you might use it as an opportunity. We are available 24/7 to any of you. We certainly have people reach out at all times, day or night, right? Things that need some urgent assistance don't always happen between 9 and 5, Monday through Friday. So we have 24/7 availability with a 1-hour callback time, and that fairly regularly gets utilized, which we're happy to be able to provide. So you can reach out to us directly anytime. The number that I gave you at the beginning is a good one for that. And email, I'll have that information for you as well. So we are on site, and maybe you've seen us already. We can do introductions, we can do ride-alongs, roll calls. We're trying to build familiarity. So we're trying to normalize the use of mental health care and support services, so that, you know, there's no assumption any of you need it, but if you ever do, we're around is the idea. And so there has been a huge reduction in stigma at different agencies in Minnesota, and there's more work to do. And I'll talk more about stigma and suggest some ways of thinking about mental health care that might be helpful. Let's see, I think that's the main pieces there. So I said I was going to explain check-ins to you, so I'll just do that right off the bat in case people have any questions or concerns. So a check-in, I'll start with what it is not. It isn't therapy. It isn't any kind of evaluation or any kind of treatment. So we're not taking any notes. We're not documenting anything about our conversation. We're not opening up a medical record even. Everything stays outside of our electronic medical records. And then even those are not tied into any other kind of larger healthcare system like Epic. So if you go to the doctor and they use Epic, they can often see where else you've gone for different types of care. They wouldn't see that you worked with us for therapy, and certainly not for a check-in. So we don't take any notes, and that's because it's really just a conversation. It's a chance to consult about anything you'd like, or nothing at all. We don't have an expectation of what you share with us. So We are really just there with the goal of kind of meeting you where you're at with what you would like to run by us or chat through or start to discuss. Or we may just be sharing some information with you. How are you doing individually in different areas? Do you need any information or strategies regarding anything you might be struggling with? And this means anything professionally or personally, right? We take the same brain and nervous system and body home with us and then back to work. And so it's all, this makes up the same kind of big picture of your health. So the check-ins are that conversation with a mental health professional. It's no cost to you. Many agencies, probably about 30 of the 45 we work with, are having these be for all staff. And the idea there is certainly not that there's an assumption that everyone needs it, but more so to help reduce stigma. So you may not need the check-in, but your colleague might. And so your attendance will hopefully make it easier to reach out if you ever do need it, but maybe more immediately it might help someone and care about, connect them to something that they really need, but maybe wouldn't have reached out for otherwise. And so that's what we're seeing a lot of, is that really every agency we work with, we're having people tell us, I really do need some support in this or that way, and I never would have reached out. So I'm really glad we're doing this. So that's kind of what we're doing here with some agencies having those be mandatory. There's the educational piece to it. Some people come in and they say, you know what, I know I want to use some further sessions. Can we just kind of jump in? And we can absolutely do that as well. You can even get on the schedule for your next appointment if you'd like. And whoever you meet with doesn't have to be who you stay with. But you'll see there's a few of us who come up and do these check-ins, but really you can choose from any of the 6 of us, whoever might be the best fit for you. All right. Let me know in the chat or speak up if you have any questions on those. I like to just reiterate confidentiality on those because it's usually the most important piece for people. We don't give any information back to agencies, not to the peer support team, not to admin, none of that. Written into our service agreements is the understanding that all of our work stays completely confidential. So no matter what you're talking to us about, we're not going to repeat that to anybody else. So that's a really important piece to know. The more honest you can be with us, the more we can help you. And so we take that really seriously. Really, every peer support team, every wellness program relies on that trust and the confidentiality. And so that is something that we take very seriously. It's required by law, of course, HIPAA and privacy laws, but we also understand there's really kind of another level to it. And we understand to the extent that we're not even giving like big picture overall feedback to agencies about how people are doing generally, or if we're noticing a certain trend that many people are struggling with or things like that. We tend to see a lot of patterns at the different agencies with whatever their particular challenges might be, but we're not sharing those because we don't want anyone to interpret anything we're sharing as a breach of confidentiality. All right, so let's start talking about the stress response system. So this is, I'm going to talk a lot today about the brain. It's really the command center for our entire body. Our brain is this soft structure that's sort of just hidden in the dark kind of cave of our skull, and it's connected to the spinal cord, which runs down our back, and then from the spinal cord comes our nerves, and those reach all the way out to the tips of our toes and our fingers. And so our brain sits up there and it really helps command everything in the entire body, every process in your body. And so when information hits our brain through our senses, so our eyes, our ears, our nose, our mouth, our skin, our brain gets information and then has to interpret it and do something with it. And so in any human is going to interpret information sometimes as stressful, and then a stress response needs to be initiated. So once the brain interprets it as stressful and initiates this response, it's always going to look like fight, flight, or freeze. And so your system will respond very quickly to stress. It'll respond faster than the thinking brain. And that's why when you get into a stressful scenario where your adrenaline has to kick in and you need to take action, which is fight mode, this is why you don't even really need to think about it, right? If you had to think about it, your reaction time would probably be too slow. And so you have been trained, and through experiences, your brain has really learned and been primed to predict and know how to respond. So that's the other thing the brain does, is it predicts. It learns from everything you've experienced so far, and it applies that knowledge to the future. So here's where we'll talk more about stress and how stress can end up being kind of harmful or dangerous to us. So I talk about zebras when I talk about stress. And the reason is because there's a book by Robert Sapolsky, and it's called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. Somebody noticed it on the shelf at my office this week and was like, what is that? I said, I know, it's kind of an intriguing title, right? Nerdy people like me tend to read books like that. So I'll distill it down to a couple of things. And one of them here is kind of like, why do humans get stress-related ailments and illnesses and diseases, and other mammals typically don't? And so why don't zebras get ulcers is kind of the question he poses. And then he explains how we're both mammals, but why does it happen differently? So let's back up just briefly. I want to explain stress. So what is stress? It's that disruption of homeostasis, right? It's like instead of a balance in our system gets out of balance because of stress, straining our system, kind of pulling resources from us. And then the stress response is meant to return us to that balance. So stress is actually good. And I know that's odd. It gets talked about as a bad thing mostly, but we actually need stress to be healthy. And so if we didn't have adrenaline and a stress response, we wouldn't get out of bed in the morning. That's why we get up and we get going. And the thoughts we have about what we have to do, maybe earn money, or maybe we have a sense of purpose. And those are the things that get us going and motivate. And so it's a good thing, but it can, of course, be taken too far, and it can be too much when it goes on for too long. So here's the thing about zebras. If you're a zebra, what are you stressed about? And you can just type into the chat here. What are you going to be stressed about if you imagine that you're a zebra? Somebody always gets it. There's three main things. Everybody comes up with two usually, sometimes even the third. But it's really that simple. There really only is three things that will cause stress for a zebra. So yeah, somebody mentioned getting eaten. And then eating also, you have to worry about starvation. You have to worry about survival. Somebody mentioned mating. There's certainly a biological drive for mating, which is what, of course, continues our existence. But it isn't often a source of stress for mammals, at least. It may be for humans more so. But absolutely, so they have to worry about predators and starvation, finding water, hydration. And then the other thing would just be injury. If they're injured, there may be pain, which can cause chronic stress, and they may not then be able to get away from a predator. So it's really about just survival for zebras. It's kind of simplified down to that for them. So let's imagine again that you're a zebra, and again in the chat box, what are you not worried about if you're a zebra? So it's really just these three things that you are worried about. What are all the things that humans worry about that zebras don't have to worry about? Maybe not all of the things, but what are a few things? you're not having to worry about. Somebody said bills, finance, having a bad hair day. Yeah, right? Usually someone suggests they probably don't worry if they're actually white with black stripes or black with white stripes. I think there was a consensus on that, actually. I can't remember what it was, though. If they're smelly, do they need to take a shower? How is their hygiene? Yeah, these are not concerns that zebras have to have. And so they're not really worried about that cute zebra over there. They just sort of have an instinctual drive for mating. They also aren't having to worry about survival unless their survival is currently at risk. And so the idea here is that, I mean, man, life or death scenario, right? You're being chased by a lion. And if this zebra lives to talk about it in whatever way they communicate, they are, what's happened is they survived. They probably outlasted maybe the lion in the chase. And then they're going to do like a full body shake, like a dog does, right? When they pull away from kind of wrestling with other dogs or whatnot, they'll shake their full body. That actually kind of clears out the stress chemicals from them. They're probably going to lap up a bunch of water and rehydrate, and then like take a nap in the shade for a while and refill those resources too. So in opposition to that is anyone who works in law enforcement, corrections, fire, EMS. You just have to go do the next thing, right? You're not like, okay, that was a really incredibly stressful thing, and I think I better just take a week off now to recover, or even an hour sometimes. It can just be incident to incident to incident. And you can tell that the days where those kinds of things happen more often and more frequently, and the worse they are, the things that happen, the more stress and tension your body will tend to carry. So zebras kind of have it figured out in that way. Not that they're doing it consciously, but they don't get ulcers. They don't get post-traumatic stress disorder. They don't get, have a lowered immune system and get cancer and dementia and cardiovascular disease the way that humans do, because humans will leave work, take that stress with them. Our brains, especially when you see a lot of, when you have a lot of exposure to stressful events within the jail, it's efficient out of efficiency, and it's always an intelligent response, right? Out of efficiency, your brain is likely to want to stay in this chronic state of stress because you're going to return to it at the next shift. And so out of efficiency, your brain might say, let's just stay stressed, and then we're going to be ready for the next stressor that we know is coming. So unlike in, the population out there, where in a lifetime there's, 2, 3 major stressors that are potentially traumatic. In your line of work, it might be every day or week or, whatever the frequency is, it's a lot higher than in the general population. So it's very understandable if your brain adjusts and decides, let's just stay stressed, because then we're going to be ready. We're predicting a lot more is coming, and that's probably an accurate prediction. But it's also the thing that'll wear you down, is to hold on to that stress chronically. That's the toxic part of it. So we're built for the things that temporarily knock our system out of balance, but not the pieces that that keep us chronically stressed. These are some of the trauma exposures for corrections staff. You've got, violence that you witness. There can be deceased bodies, homicides, suicides. You can see inmates with trauma-based behaviors and histories, or hear about those things. You may see some of those things playing out in kind of disturbing or distressing ways. Dangerous encounters are common, dangerous work conditions, assaults, self-mutilation, photos or media of traumatic events, threats to you or your family of physical or sexual violence, and then witnessing or assisting someone suffering, hearing the stories even of coworkers who have been harmed, any of those things are potentially traumatic to our systems. And they are really what make up a lot of the work that you end up doing at some point in your work there. So tell me if I'm missing any kind of major category, but these are the main kind of aspects of a stress exposure for corrections. These are some of the stress symptoms to watch for. So I'm going to stay on this slide for a little bit here so you can look through these for yourself. And I'll say it's really common for irritability. I put it at the top of the list because it's the one that I see most commonly. And the thing about irritability is kind of twofold. On the one hand, it tends to be that fight mode. So there's fight, flight, or freeze. It tends to be fight mode, like, which is just action mode. I don't mean that you're throwing punches necessarily, but more so like ready to take action and do something. It tends to be that mode sort of spilling over, maybe into a time when you don't need to have that mode sort of activated. And that can even look like anger. Our memory gets impaired with stress, and certainly also with a sleep debt. And then physical tension is really common. A lot of times we'll notice physical tension before feelings or emotions. And we really hold feeling and emotion and stress in our body as, and stress we hold as tension. So I'll talk more about that in a bit. Sleep disturbances are common to have trouble falling asleep or staying asleep. And nightmares, any of those three, especially more than just occasionally, are a sign of a stress response, of very possibly a sign of a stress response. Not all the time, sometimes there's something medical going on or whatnot. But the other one I want to just mention is feeling numb or detached. And this one is kind of like, it's when your brain has decided it's overloaded with too much stress that's sort of sitting there unprocessed, and it'll sort of shut down and say, it's too much, so I'm just not going to feel anything at all. And so when you notice that, it usually kind of happens in the background. Others may notice it. Usually it gets noticed by loved ones who say you're sort of distant or detached. And it's kind of a misapplication of this numbing mechanism, which is also very much a stress response. And so there's a difference between numb and neutral. If you can experience something stressful or even traumatic and feel pretty neutral towards it, that's a good thing. I mean, you have to have kind of a healthy level of detachment in the work that you do. But if you misapply that detachment too far, it can become numbness. It can get misapplied at home and elsewhere. And you're using it as a coping mechanism to kind of the feeling of overwhelm, but it is more like a wall in front of a lot of unprocessed emotion rather than an actual numbness or neutrality. So keep an eye on that one. It can kind of creep up on people. A good way to know if it's there is, again, if your loved ones are telling you, but also if you have trouble feeling positive emotion. Numbness is not going to just block out the negative emotions. You're also going to put a lid on the positive emotions. And so if you don't feel joy or, awe or beauty or, anything on the higher end of our emotional range, on the positive end, you may have this numbness happening as a protective mechanism, of course. All of these things that I mentioned are really very intelligent responses to stress exposure. It's your brain learning from what you've experienced, and that takes into account everything you experience outside of work, that you experienced in childhood, major losses. Any of these things can, chronic pain is also kind of can be part of your stack of stress, injuries, those kinds of things. And you're having, if you have any of these stress symptoms, they're very intelligent responses given what you've experienced. It's just important to know when it's kind of stacking up to a point where it's reducing your capacity to take on more stress in a healthy way. So if day one of your work, you imagine that you have this container that's related to stress accumulation, and the container was maybe empty, or maybe you didn't grow up, in Pleasantville with a white picket fence, and there may have been something in there ahead. But the idea is, where has it stacked up to? Because a lot of times your sleep is going to help you process stress, your exercise, feeling supported, your friends, your family, your colleagues, having things that you do for fun, have a balanced life, all of that is going to help process a lot of that stress. And so it won't all stick, but what does stick, it's important to keep track of and to know, how much capacity do you have for the stress that's coming. You always know there's more coming. You don't just go work at a job where you count widgets or something. And so you need to have the capacity for the stress that you know is ahead. All right, so here I'm going to talk to you about the difference between stress and trauma. I've kind of described stress and explained to you some of the brain science of it. It's always going to show up as fight, flight, or freeze. So you're always going to either be able to take action, which you're trained to do in your work, or not as safe of a response. And what I worry about is flight or freeze, any kind of hesitation, or just wanting to get away and avoid any stress. Those are signs that your stress response, sometimes overreacting is another stress response, which can happen, but more often it turns into flight or freeze. So the difference between stress and trauma is when your system gets overwhelmed by the demand of the stressor, that's essentially what causes it to be traumatic. And I'm talking about trauma as, really a chemical response to what's happening. It's when the capacity isn't there for the demand that is needed on your system, it can end up being traumatic to your system. So this isn't about like being weak or a victim or something. It's actually a chemical process that's happening based on, how well primed you were and ready for that big stressor, or just how many little t traumas have stacked up, which doesn't leave much room for another one. So powerlessness usually ends up looking or feeling like guilt. So if you ever have an incident that you have been feeling guilty about, it usually means that there was a sense of helplessness. And it may not even make logical sense. You may know that you did everything you could, but essentially it was a big enough incident that it left your system sort of feeling helpless, which means it may have been traumatic for you. And then abandoned is related to helplessness. It's if someone really should have been there for you who wasn't. And I see this really commonly when folks experience something awful and then they don't get the support that they needed, maybe from peers or admin or a supervisor, or when they get home with family or whatnot. That can really reduce your resiliency. Your ability to bounce back can be reduced, and then it can stick with you because you did need that support. Your system needed it. We can't help but need that. We're just so wired for connection and support that if it isn't there, it can actually increase the chances that an incident will hit your system as traumatic versus just stressful. So with post-traumatic stress kind of being, I guess, the enemy here, it's good to know your enemy well, right? So I'm giving you a lot of information on this. When you understand it well, I think you are able to notice signs of it sooner and address it sooner and not let it have as big of a negative effect on you. So that's kind of the goal here on that piece of wellness. So there's 4 diagnostic clusters related to post-traumatic stress disorder. Re-experiencing is like when you're having nightmares or flashbacks, or even if, we all have those snapshots in our mind. of just distressing stuff you had to see or do. And those snapshots are a sign that your brain stored the memory of that event in a way that is different than any other memory. And the reason it did that is because it was an important memory, and it was flagged as important because it was tied to a stress response. So that adrenaline rush may feel exciting. You may not feel in the moment like it hit you very hard, and it very well may not have. But if it's stored vividly in that way, or even in a fragmented way, but parts of the incident are vivid, that means that it isn't filed away correctly. So that means that it's sitting there. When there's a lot of those, that's when you can, a lot of that re-experiencing can happen, whether you're trying to pull up those experiences or they're just popping up for you in an unwanted way. Those are signs that you may fall kind of somewhere on this spectrum regarding stress. Avoidance, another intelligent response. It's when there is a certain type of situation going on, or a certain inmate comes in the door and you are noticing your body having like an avoidance reaction. Like, I don't want to deal with that. I know that that's going to cause me more stress than the next thing. The next thing may not bother you, but it bothers someone else. These are all very unique to the experiences that you've had. And it's honestly, it's intelligent responses, right? It's your brain telling you, don't go do that. That's going to be more stressful than something else. Let's reserve our resources, but you just probably have to go do it anyway, right? And so it's just something to notice and be aware of, because it may help you know where you're at on that spectrum regarding stress. Negative cognitions and mood, these are like negative thoughts about yourself, like that I'm a failure, or that I'm weak. And then it's signs of depression or anxiety, but unless you came into this work with depression or anxiety, it's more likely that those are actually kind of secondary to the post-traumatic stress. Usually, I mean, everyone we work with, you're all very mentally strong, and you have a large capacity, larger than most, for stress. And it's really just the added experiences of stress that tend to weigh you down and start to cause these symptoms. So as trauma treatment specialists, our approach is always what has happened that's sort of taught your brain to behave and function the way it is, and for you to feel the way you're feeling, instead of thinking there's something wrong with you. It's usually just a very intelligent stress response you're having, which can show up in a lot of different ways. And I'll talk more about that. Arousal and reactivity. This is when maybe just walking in the door, you notice your adrenaline go up, or in a negative way, or you're in a scenario. Like, most of the time I have an officer say, I'm here because I wanted to talk about what happened. I was in this scenario that really shouldn't have had me as fearful and worked up as I was. And I'm worried because I was having kind of this disproportionate reaction. And that is your nervous system telling you, hey, we've been in something like this before. We've been in too many of these kinds of things. And so we're being reminded of that stuff, and we're going to activate this stress response. And that's pretty unsettling, because you may logically know that you don't need to be feeling that way. And to feel out of control is dangerous, of course, in your profession. And so it can be pretty unsettling, but it's another sign of, stress response. So there's a certain amount of each of these categories that someone has to have to meet criteria. And it all works on a spectrum, with 0 to 8 kind of being the scale. Between a 3 and a 4 is where someone would meet criteria. And then beyond that, there's mild, moderate, and severe PTSD. So it's actually an injury to the brain. The brain is unable to tell the difference if what happened to you is still happening or if it happened in the past. And that's the very unsettling thing about it, is the nervous system and the brain, when it has this injury from an overabundance of trauma, the brain will start to replay the stress response as if those things are still happening. It can easily be tripped up or triggered to be reminded of these things, and then it'll replay them, sometimes in pretty subtle ways, and other times in very obvious ways, just depending on kind of where someone falls on this spectrum. So in the more severe forms, there is commonly thoughts of suicide, above a 7, or even lower sometimes, is when it isn't uncommon for the brain to come up with a way to get out of this very uncomfortable situation. And that's when suicide can arise in the mind as an option. It's just trying to problem solve, but if someone who's having those thoughts, if they turn into any kind of plan or intention, that's of course where they become dangerous. Just having the thoughts is often extremely and understandably very unsettling, and is certainly worth, reaching out and talking about it, getting the help that you need, increasing your resilience, your efforts towards your resilience factors. So we're going to take a 10-minute break here since we're halfway in, and we will come back at 1:01. So I'll put this on pause here, and do what you need to do, step away, whatever you need, and I'll see you in just a few minutes. All right, let's pick back up. So I just briefly want to show you here what parts of the brain I'm speaking to. Any mental health professional should really be very well versed in brain science and somewhat even kind of anatomy. And so what I want to point out is two areas. The amygdala, this is one of the parts of your brain that has to do with your threat detection. It will initiate a fear response. And then the hippocampus has to do with memory and learning. And when information hits the brain through the senses, the amygdala and the brainstem area will respond first. So that the older part of our brain, that even lizards have this older part of our brain, this brainstem area. It's what runs our processes and systems automatically and subconsciously. And even when we're unconscious, you could still be breathing and have a heart rate, reflexes, body temperature, those kinds of things. That's the part of the brain that without thinking about it, without thinking like our prefrontal cortex does, you can react to the danger. And this is the part of the brain that initiates that stress response. So when someone has post-traumatic stress disorder, the amygdala actually gets enlarged and the hippocampus actually shrinks. So you become worse at filing away memories properly, and you become better, quote unquote, at detecting fear. So you'll detect fear more often than you did previously, which is usually more than necessary. And then you'll have a harder time filing away memories of distressing stuff. And so that's how it can sort of be a compiling effect there pretty quickly. So that's why we really want to help people keep your resilience strong with the 6 factors I'll talk about, and then keep the stress that's kind of been stacking up for you low so that you stay as far away from post-traumatic stress disorder as you can. This is a stress meter. If you haven't seen it already, I'll be sending it out again at the end of the year here to be distributed to all staff. It's something to just keep an eye on. Think about how you're doing, notice which one of these categories you're falling into. And then below is kind of what you can do. It's normal to be in kind of the mild or the yellow area, or even the orange for short periods of time, as long as you're kind of rebounding and bouncing back. But even being in the mild area for very long is another indicator to potentially ask for help, either from the peer support team or from one of us or a professional who you might already be using or want to use. So there's some ideas here. We certainly use this in our check-ins. You'll be able to, if you would like to, let us know if you're noticing any symptoms in any of these categories. And if you're in this resilient category, that's fantastic. I love getting to hear about that. What's helping you be resilient, stay resilient? Have you struggled at some point and found your way, or kind of what got you there? That's good too. So we're looking forward to getting to chat with you. So I'm a therapist. Of course, I'm going to talk about feelings at some point here, but I'm going to do so in kind of with this metaphor. So it's sort of like in your line of work, you have to stay, on guard, no pun intended. You have to stay hypervigilant. You have to be ready for whatever is next, ready to take action under stress. And so that leads you to kind of inevitably have to train yourself, for good reason, to just sort of pack away how you might feel or what you might need. So even though your nervous system is probably pretty good at telling you, like, hey, I need to eat, my glucose is low, I'm thirsty, I need to use the restroom, I'm tired, I need to close my eyes, I'm feeling disconnected, I'm feeling isolated, I need more of this or that. In your line of work, you often just have to kind of pack that away and just do the next thing. And when you have trained yourself to do that for so long and under under stress, where it gets reinforced for safety reasons to operate that way, it can be really hard to do it any differently. So one of the keys to being resilient in your line of work is knowing that it's important to, at some point, just stop for a minute whenever it is safe and you have a chance to do so. Notice how you're doing, how you're feeling, just acknowledge it, like tune back into yourself. What do you need? Take care of those needs and be able to go back and forth between that operating mode at work and then taking a break from that. And, I think of it as we all have baggage. It's just a matter of if you've ever opened up the baggage and sorted through it and washed it and dried it and folded it and given away or gotten rid of what you don't want to keep with you and what you can get rid of, and then knowing what it all is and packing it back in neatly, because otherwise it can start to look like this. And at some point, you can imagine this stack of baggage is a mess and it's going to topple over at some point. And so that's what I really don't want to have happen for you. We see that a lot, and we're trying to be an upstream approach and get ahead of that happening as often as it does, or ever if we could. You can imagine as well, if you have a spouse or a partner or a significant other who has their own large stack of baggage that's never been unpacked and sorted through, and they both can topple over or topple each other's over, and it can get pretty messy. So we've talked about stress. I talked about trauma and the difference between stress and trauma. And now I'm going to talk about resilience. So I'll use the rest of the time here to talk about the 6 factors that make up resilience. And really, this is about trying to maximize the available resources that you can have so that you can adequately manage the stress that you know is ahead in your line of work. So these are the 6 factors. I'm going to try to minimize this box here. So these are the 6 factors, and they are, the first one here, sleep and non-sleep deep rest, is the most important one. And then exercise is a close second. And then after that, these are all really important. I did purposely put professional care last, but support, balanced life, and mindset, those are all just really important in there. So I'm going to start with sleep because it's the most important piece for your brain health, and it's the most important piece for making sure that you're staying resilient. It's also something that will get affected usually pretty easily if you are under a lot of stress. So I'll go into sleep a little bit more here. So why do we sleep? We sleep because our brain needs to repair itself. It needs to, during our REM cycles, rapid eye movement sleep, during our REM sleep, our memory is trying to file away what it's experienced. And so it will, if you have enough REM sleep, it will help repair your brain. And then deep sleep will help repair your organs and your muscles and tissues and the rest of your body. But REM sleep is so important for brain health, and particularly for mental health, that if we are sleep deprived, the next time we fall asleep, our brain will very quickly go into REM sleep because it really needs to catch up on that more than anything else. So that's really why sleep is so critical for our mental health. If you are sleep deprived, you cannot have as good of mental health as you could if you catch up on a sleep debt. You only have a couple days to catch up on missed sleep. You can't make up for what you lost last week or 2 months ago or 2 years ago. And so it needs to happen pretty quickly. So if after a rotation, you're sleep deprived and you sleep a lot that first day off, that's a good thing to catch up when you can and as soon as you can. The other thing about sleep is it's your brain preparing you. It's preparing your brain for the next wake cycle. When you wake up feeling good and rested, you're probably ready to take on more challenges and stress. And if you wake up sleep deprived, you're not well equipped for it. So while you're asleep, your brain goes through different sleep cycles. It's kind of incredible if you look at brain scans of people who are sleeping, their brains are so active that it can even look like they're awake. There's like huge, big things happening in your brain when you're sleeping. And it has all direct correlation to your overall health of your brain and your body and longevity. So your brain is filtering through these different cycles over and over throughout your sleep duration. And you want to have quality sleep by having uninterrupted sleep. So as much as you can avoid, light, sound, white noise doesn't count. You should use white noise if you're otherwise being woken up by sound. But you want to minimize all of the sensory input that you can so that your brain can just be completely focused on those sleep cycles. Your circadian rhythm is really key to our health as well. And there's a book called The Circadian Code, which is a really neat book if you have interest in kind of like what makes us tick in this 24-hour clock. Just like the tides are sort of based on the moon, our rhythm of our body and our brain is based on this 24-hour clock. And so if you're having to flip your schedule and work nights and then sometimes be awake during the day, that's really hard on you. And the reason is because of your circadian rhythm. It's actually better to always sleep during the day if you usually have to for work. Sometimes because of family and whatnot, you have to flip and make those switches, but that's harder on you than just staying on a night shift. I'll explain to you adenosine a little bit. So this is how caffeine works, if you don't already know. Adenosine is a chemical that starts to build up every minute that we're awake. So as soon as you wake up for your wake cycle, whether that's up in the morning or in the afternoon, if you work nights, adenosine is going to start to build up. And what it does is it creates kind of a sleep pressure. And so the only thing that can relieve adenosine is to go to sleep, and then it'll lower the level of adenosine back down. What caffeine does is it actually blocks your adenosine receptors. So if you drink caffeine, you won't feel the adenosine because it's not being received, but it's still building up behind the scenes. So when the caffeine wears off, that's why you can get a crash in your energy, because the adenosine was still building up in the background, and now the caffeine has worn off, and now you feel all of it. And now it's at a higher level than it was before. So the only thing that lowers that adenosine buildup is sleep. And it's the only way to really give your brain what it needs, the most important thing that it needs for health. This is a visual of that circadian clock. We actually have a little part of our brain up above our palate in our mouth that runs this circadian clock. So when you wake up, say you wake up at 4:30 to be at work by 6, if you expose yourself to some light, it's probably the sun hasn't risen yet, but when it does rise, hopefully you can get light within about an hour. Overhead light helps, but sunlight is the best, even if it's cloudy. If you eat a meal, that's going to wake up your organs. If you exercise, that's going to cue your body. All right, we're awake. We're going to start this 24-hour clock. And then you'll notice that, about 12 hours later, you'll start to get tired. If you again have light exposure to the sun that's at an angle in the afternoon, or if you're waking up because you work nights, still getting that sun exposure is important to cue your body that now your day has started. You can help kind of solidify this rhythm that your brain really needs to be on. There are also some tips in there for helping shift your sleep cycle if you're having to flip from doing shift work. So such as if you are ending your last night shift, say at 6 a.m., you could take a 3-hour nap. That's going to be 2 sleep cycles because they're 90 minutes long. And then you can try to reset yourself by using sun exposure and food intake to let your body know, okay, now we're starting. What you don't want to do is expose your eyes, and specifically your retinas, to light if you want to fall asleep. So if the sun is rising before you're heading home to go to sleep after a night shift, you want to wear sunglasses, you want to turn off overhead lights, because light is such a strong influencer to our brain. If you have that light exposure, your brain will think, well, we didn't get any sleep last night, but clearly the sun is up, so we just need to kick in a second wind here. And then if you try to go to sleep, you may fall asleep out of exhaustion, but your brain will say, oh, I guess we're going to take a nap, so I'm going to pop you back awake in about 3 or 4 hours. And so that's kind of a tip there. There's a podcast called the Huberman Lab Podcast, and that information is from him. He's a Stanford neuroscientist, and he speaks to shift work, and really appreciates all of you who do shift work, because it's hard on you, and he gives lots of tips and strategies about it in a couple of his episodes. So there's lots of awful, bad, horrible, no good news related to sleep deprivation. These are some of the side effects from missing sleep. Literally everything head to toe suffers. You have a higher risk of diabetes, type 2, your testosterone decreases just with one night of sleep deprivation, of about 4, if you get 4 hours of sleep, just one night, your testosterone and estrogen for women will greatly decrease. And it just throws off all kinds of things. So if there's one thing to do going forward here, I would say it would be important to start to adjust sleep, get more sleep if you can, improve your sleep hygiene, do whatever you can. And I know your jobs make it difficult, but anything you can do to get more sleep is going to be, you're going to kind of get the biggest bang for your buck. So I mentioned that there's sleep and then there's non-sleep deep rest. And what I'm talking about here is how intensity is really built into your work. And so you need to build in recovery. And so besides being, actually asleep and getting the sleep you need, that's important. But it's also important to offset this intensity level with enough recovery even during the day. So if you counteract that intensity with, taking some deep breaths, tactical breathing, stretching, maybe having a stress relieving conversation with someone who is a support to you. Any of these kinds of ideas are going to be a little bit of a break for you that you don't need to be asleep to get, but it's still going to help your brain kind of down regulate. There's all this upregulation intensity that happens with stress, and it's important to be very aware and intentionally kind of calming your system. That way you don't have as far to go at the end of your shift, and you can hopefully return to fully recovered and rested before your next shift or next rotation. What can happen otherwise is you can find yourself inching up towards being just stuck in fight or flight mode. Essentially, when that intensity builds and builds and builds and that container is filling that I mentioned with that metaphor, you have a ways to go to recover, and it can be a long road. So I encourage you to do what you can, even during your shifts, to try to release tension through breath work, stretching, taking a walk, getting your mind off of constantly having to be kind of hyper vigilant, and you're going to notice a difference. This kind of leads into talking about exercise, but it's also kind of a recovery piece. Hips and shoulders and neck tend to be sore spots and areas of injury for folks who are in your profession. And so these are just a couple of stretches for both areas that you can engage in. Just really 30 seconds each, best case a minute in any of these, and you should notice some tension release. When you release tension from muscles, you're also just reducing your overall stress level. So these are some hopefully very accessible, easy ideas. I'm a registered yoga teacher, and so I like to bring in that angle, because there really is no difference between our brain health and our physical health. And so to release tension in your physical body is going to help you feel better overall. These are the benefits to your mental health of exercise. It reduces stress. It helps clear out cortisol or adrenaline. It's going to give you better mood. It'll release endorphins, which are kind of a feel-good chemical in your brain, which energizes you and gives you better motivation. You can rest more easily when you're exercising regularly. You can feel more of a sense of control, better mental clarity, just like so many mental health benefits to exercise. And really, it's 150 minutes a week that we all need. So 150 minutes, even if that's 5 30-minute brisk walks. If you exercise more intensely, sometimes you may need less than 150 minutes, but that's the general guideline, and it really is true. So the next piece here is connectedness. At home, of course, feeling supported at work is important, but something you have a little more control over potentially is how connected you are in your personal life. And I want to just point out how understandable and common it is to allow work to kind of, not only the stress of it, to bring it home with you, but really even just the way you need to operate at work can start to affect your home life. So if at work you need to be hypervigilant, decisive, very consistent, pretty detached, and then, like I explained, kind of overriding your nervous system, having to sort of ignore what it is that you need right now, it's sort of a tune out from a lot of the ways that really you need to be tuned in at home. So at home, really what you need and what your family needs from you is like to be calm and flexible and consistent, tuned in, playful, generous, right? Able to kind of go with the flow regarding the chaos that just inevitably comes with, young kids or teenagers or family life, and be able to sort of roll with it. And that's not always easy to do, because for safety reasons, you get very ingrained, you can get ingrained in this operating mode at work. And so this happens in all areas of law enforcement and the first responder world and emergency medicine and all of these jobs where you have so much overlap in the intensity at work. And so it's something to be aware of. It can get in the way of your connectedness at home. You may have loved ones who notice that the work has changed you. And this is why. There's a good, intelligent reason for it. It's because at work, there are safety concerns that you always need to be ready for. And so again, out of efficiency, your brain will think, well, let's just stay in this mode, because, if you go home, you're not, it's not like a deployment. You aren't going to another continent or country. And you may still have reminders of work wherever you go. It may not be far from work. But you also know that you're headed right back pretty soon, before long. So that's something to keep an eye on, and to try to create something that you do purposely to help yourself kind of dial back and tune in to what you need, get your needs met, and then be able to attend to your loved ones. Because, the work is, of course, about safety and some needs that have to be met, hopefully a sense of purpose, but investing in your family is a long-term investment, and will help you with your resilience long-term when you can keep it going strong. The next resilience factor here is mindset. So this is about mental hardiness. It's essentially the ability to continue to grow and stay strong through challenges. And so it's made up of a few different things here. And I'm going to start with control. So it's important to have a sense of the difference between what you can and can't control. So if this circle here represents everything, what you can control is represented there, and that's like a magnified version of it, right? So what we can control is actually very limited. It's really limited to just ourselves. And what is it about ourselves that we can control? It's our thoughts, our actions, our attitude, and our effort. And so that's it. Those 4 things. You can choose what thoughts you're going to have. You can choose what actions you're going to take and how much energy you're going to put or effort into those actions. And then what kind of attitude you're going to have towards things is up to you as well. Beyond that, you have, of course, some influence on those around you, and that's powerful as well. But it's really important to be super dialed into what matters to you, what you can control, and where do those things overlap. And when that's what you're spending most of your energy on, you're going to feel the best and have the strongest mentality. So the other pieces of mental hardiness are commitment. This is a sense of purpose and engagement in life. Challenge. This is about viewing challenges as opportunities for growth and development. And then optimism is acknowledging when it really isn't okay right now, but believing that it will be later, and believing in your ability to do things to help make sure that it does get better. So that's kind of the main stuff that makes up mindset. Let me know if you have any questions at this point. Otherwise, I'll go on here to talk about the importance of a balanced life, and then professional care, and then I'll end up giving you kind of a case example, like a side-by-side case example of 2 officers who experienced a critical incident, and kind of where they were prior to it, what happened during it, and how they fared, and then how they did kind of longer term as well. So, all right. I don't see any questions, so I will keep going. So this resilience factor is about living a balanced life. So this is if a third of your lifetime is spent sleeping, hopefully about 8 hours, or in bed 8 hours, hopefully, and maybe not sleeping quite as much as that. But if you don't get at least 6.5, you're probably sleep deprived. There's about 1% of the population who genuinely needs less than 6.5 hours, but that's really rare. So if you're asleep for about a third of your life, you're working for about a third, then what do you do with the other third? That would be your free time, your personal time, your family time. Are you connected with your family? Are you engaged in things you enjoy doing? Do you have activities or hobbies? What do you do for fun? Hopefully these aren't just things you used to do, but are things that you still do. And that fun factor essentially is so important for your mental health, partly because it's a break for your brain from always having to think ahead and plan like you need to do a lot in your line of work. And it's a break from, reviewing the past. And we need to do those things. We need to look ahead to the future, and we need to review the past. We can learn a lot from the past. We can plan and be prepared for what's coming up. But if you do too much of the looking ahead, it can feel like anxiety. And if you do too much of the looking back, it can feel like rumination or depression. And so having a good balance where hopefully in a lot of your personal time, you're just kind of directly experiencing life, that's a good thing. That's our other operating mode. So when you think about Charlie, our shepherd, our German Shepherd dog, dogs just live in the moment, right? Certainly I have a rescue as well, and she clearly experienced some traumatic things before we got her. And so her brain operates a little differently, but generally a dog will live in this moment. And she does too. It's if she gets triggered, you can snap her out of it pretty quickly by introducing some food or something that brings her right back into the present moment. But that's kind of the joy of a dog, right? They're just always present right now. And we think of them as just very happy, right? Because they're always just right here, right now. They're not worrying and they're not ruminating about what happened earlier. So there's a lesson there for us a little bit. Stretching, breath work, some of those things are ways to get bits and pieces of this direct experiencing throughout your day if you want to start practicing those. Whatever you have trained your brain to do, whether it's your ability to take action under stress or it's your ability to fall back on these recovery practices, it's what you're going to be prepared to do when you really need it. So, one of the biggest pieces of advice I can give is get good at these resilience factors, because you're going to always default to your training when you're under a large amount of stress. And so if you've already patterned your brain to exercise regularly and sleep well and be connected and know what you do to recover, and have patterns of thinking that's healthy, you're going to be stronger and more resilient when hard things come up. So the last one here is about access to professional care. And so access is certainly growing. There's more and more professionals who are becoming occupationally competent in working with first responders. And so a lot of the barrier left is mostly about stigma. And so stigma has to do with, thinking of your brain health differently than your body's health, essentially. So nobody usually hesitates to say, yeah, I went to the foot doctor today, because I sprained my ankle. That's not a big deal, but it tends to be harder for us to say, I went to the therapist or the psychiatrist or whatever that might be. So we're trying to help reduce that stigma by suggesting that you can't control what the profession as a whole thinks about mental health care or what our society generally thinks about it. You guys can control the perspective you decide to take, the attitude you decide to take towards it. So hopefully you can look at it the same way you look at your heart health or any other organ of your body. Hopefully you understand the kind of the adversity that you have in your work, which is not there in many lines of work, and then give yourself a little bit of room to normalize it and know that, within a career, it's normal at different times to ask for help, to need it, to benefit from it. But that doesn't mean that overall you're not very mentally strong. It's just that, I'm not an expert at other areas of life. And so I go to professionals to get help in those areas. And this is one for all of you if you ever choose to use it. These are some times when you may want to ask for professional help. You and any household family member has access to sessions with us. And so we work with couples. There's 2 of us who work with couples. And we work with individuals. Of course, I have a couple therapists who work with kiddos, teenagers, whatever might be useful for you. The quality of your family's mental health and your relationships is really important for your overall health. So I'll mention right now real quick for scheduling, there's an email address, information@marieridgway.com. That's the easiest way to reach out to schedule. If you need it at any point, you can just do that. All we'll need from you is a good phone number and a personal email address, and we would just send you some paperwork electronically. You can review it and sign it online, and that means you're all set up. You're welcome to come to one of our offices. You're welcome to wait until we're up there. We have a room that they have us use that's kind of in a back corner of a building that law enforcement doesn't use very often. And the other option is virtual. So we're happy to do any of those. And again, if you just want to problem solve something or you want to connect with us to get connected to another provider locally who maybe is insurance-based, we're happy to help you in whatever way we can. Or if you have a specific need for some kind of specialist, we can help get you connected. So what I'm trying to do here is sort of in this visual here, it's essentially about trying to outweigh the stressors that are built into your job that I've listed over here with these resilience factors. And so you've got access to care now, peer support, trainings like this and others that are coming. Your check-ins hopefully will help you get greater access. And then these are the pieces that kind of make up the resilience and things that you can do something about yourself. So feeling like you have some control is so important. And so I hope that this information has helped you, understand what you can do. I have a specific training for at the agency level, at the command staff level, what can be done. That's coming out soon. And it's included for one of your administrators to attend because of the type of program you have with us. So we're, over time, really listening for what all is needed, and we really try to be a platform to help get you what you need in your professions. So over time, we're starting to be able to come at this from different angles. We've partnered with Lexipol and Cortico and are kind of doing some parallel work within their app-based services and their online platforms. So I'm going to give you those case examples that I had mentioned. Awesome. Okay. So let me know if you have questions. Shoot them to me through that chat box if you don't mind, and I will get to them before we're done here. We have about 12 minutes left. So I'll start talking through these case examples, but please speak up if you've got questions, and I can stay long as well if you have more. So what I wanted to do is talk you through kind of this side-by-side case example where you can kind of see how well someone was equipped for a major stressor, what led to them being kind of at the resilience level they were at, and then how did that play out. So this applies to really any critical incident. These officers specifically were involved in an officer-involved shooting, but I took that out of the detail here because it's fairly irrelevant. This is going to apply across the board. So both of these officers had over 10 years of experience. I've, of course, changed any identifying information. And I've worked with, 30 or 40 officers who've been in this position specifically. But I wanted to let you know about these because it's been such a striking contrast that I've noticed over the last 4 or 5 years. So Officer 2 here, I highlighted in red kind of these risk factors. He was already having trouble sleeping and staying asleep. He has stopped exercising, and he said that was because he was kind of taking this perfectionistic approach and thinking, I can't do it the way I used to. I'm not going to sort of be where I was physically. And so he had kind of given up. Strong marriage, strong friendships, that's a really good thing. But he didn't have a lot that he enjoyed doing outside of work. So he didn't have that balanced life piece, which proved to be really important later on. He was feeling cynical, easily frustrated with others. I think that's a mindset thing. Your mindset can take a hit when you're under a lot of stress and when you're not taking good care of yourself. Understandably, you all start with strong attitudes and mindsets, but when you experience stress and it sits there, it can start to take a toll and you can get cynical and frustrated. He had a lot of accumulated work stress. It's kind of like this idea of a of a floodgate that he'd sort of put up in front of all this stuff that he hadn't processed. And when this critical incident happened, it's sort of like those floodgates opened and it all kind of came pouring out. And he said, I feel like it's all getting stirred up, stuff that I hadn't thought about in a long time. You may not realize that it's all there, but you know, sometimes when you experience enough of it, there's a little straw that breaks the camel's back, or a larger incident can just sort of stir it all up. This person was already using alcohol pretty heavily, and then also had this idea about mental health care, that it's a sign of weakness. People with post-traumatic stress are somehow different than me. That'll never happen to me. And this is something that has been really hard for this person to start to digest and to think about differently. And of course is wishing like, gosh, I wish I had known a lot of these things ahead of time. On the other hand, you can see Officer 1 was pretty squared away and having lots of activities and hobbies and strong relationships outside of work, regular exercise, solid sleep, and really was very aware of his stress levels and mental health because he'd seen other colleagues struggle and really felt for them and wanted to do everything he could to make sure that that didn't happen to him. So during the actual incident itself and within the first week, there's a few things that happened a little bit differently between these two. But one thing I want to point out is one of them who actually ended up faring better, Officer 1, he had to go hands-on with the suspect. So not only was this a critical incident where, you know, something very distressing happened and there was a life or death scenario, but he also had to go hands-on, which means that there's another sensory input now involved, which can sometimes enhance how stressful a situation is on your nervous system. So it's just something to be aware of. The more senses involved and the longer amount of time you're involved in a stressful situation, the bigger the load it is essentially on your system. So this is kind of the difference. This officer number 1 slept pretty well right away, but a couple nights later started really struggling with sleep, and that's common. Sometimes, like with Officer 2, right away really had a hard time with sleep, and then still does to this day, quite a while down the road here. And then Officer 1, the sleep disturbance started up. It can happen days later, and whether it's sleep or some other stress symptom, it can happen days later, weeks, months, or even years later. So just something to be aware of there, that there's no, you know, set schedule when a stress symptom will kick in. Officer number 1 was very thoughtful about avoiding alcohol and using it very sparingly. Officer number 2 did what he had been doing, which was really leaning on alcohol to try to numb how he felt. And unfortunately, the increase in alcohol use got to be pretty dangerous, and he's still struggling with it. So the main thing I want to tell you in this part right here is that what these officers were doing ahead of time is really what they had trained their brains to do. And so under a large amount of stress, they defaulted to their training, right? Officer 1 had trained his brain to be in this great habit of X, Y, and Z resilience factors. Officer number 2 had trained his brain to be in not such a good spot with leaning on alcohol, not getting good sleep, isolating, not having kind of a strong support network, not having a lot of hobbies and activities to fall back on. It's important when you are away from work to think, that's neat, I have all these things I get to go and do that I enjoy, right? Versus Officer 2, I remember saying, yeah, I didn't have a ton to do, and I thought maybe if I just go back to work, it'll keep me busy and it'll help. And it didn't, unfortunately. It actually just kind of compounded the injury, which is the danger, really, of coming back. You don't get to choose what is going to happen when you return to work or how stressful it's going to be. And so that stress injury can essentially be sort of compounded. It's kind of like if you sprain your ankle or get a stress fracture, you need to rest it for a while, right? You need to slowly heal and rehab it instead of just going out and pounding on the pavement for a 10-mile run. You wouldn't do that, right? Because it would just further injure you. And so that's the thing about returning too soon. This is how it looked a few months out. 30 days after an incident is the amount of time that someone usually has acute stress disorder or symptoms. It's a temporary diagnosis. And at that 30-day mark is when, if those symptoms persist, you might meet criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. Officer 2 did, and Officer 1 did not. And that's really the difference here. Officer 2, unfortunately, had to step away from work and is still trying to find his way in recovering from this injury to his brain. And it's been a long road. So I am so passionate about, telling you all these things that I've learned specific to your line of work so that you can know ahead of time, what can you be doing? What's important for you? How do you get yourself to a place where you're as resilient as you can be? You have as low of a stress level as you can. You don't have a big stack of accumulated stressors that is already kind of sitting in the background. And then you've got these routines that you're engaging in that are what you'll be able to fall back on. I've not seen anybody hit an extremely stressful point and easily be able to get into those routines. It's really best to get ahead of those major stressful events, or even just the stacked up smaller stressors, and get into those routines early on. All right. Any questions about the case examples? Kind of the side-by-side comparison. All right. Well, I will just end by saying, some takeaways here. I hope you found something that's helpful to you. If you're thinking about making a change, doing something a little differently, it's really all about the little stuff. So if you want to increase how how good you feel or how well you're functioning, you can absolutely trust, focusing on any one of these 6 areas. If you're doing everything you can regarding the 5 areas and you need some guidance or coaching or support or accountability or any of that, that's a lot of times what people are coming to us for. So you're welcome to use us in that way. But I really hope that I've given you some ideas that might inspire you, if you aren't already on top of all of these things, to even just make small changes. If you just have, water instead of soda, that's kind of a small change, but it's actually a really big change overall. If you start, taking a 30-minute walk 5 times a week instead of, nothing, that's a big change. That's really what your system needs. So giving yourself small, achievable goals is really important. Those are the things that actually make up everything. If you set yourself a goal that's unachievable, like I'm going to return to that personal record I had at 23 years old, like it's probably not going to happen, and you may never even take the first step towards it happening. So smaller steps that are achievable are a really good, satisfying way to proceed. And so that's what I would recommend. So I hope that you have a sense of purpose and meaning in your work. I know that, everyone is particularly strained lately. There's staffing shortages and just really a strenuous time in all areas of law enforcement and the first responder world right now. And I think we've worked a lot in this last year and a half with everyone in all areas of the first responder world who are having a bit of I think of it as like a identity or purpose crisis in their professional life, wondering, like, can I keep doing this? It's gotten harder. And so I always say, it's good to do everything you can that you're in control of and make decisions with a clear mind, make big decisions, especially with a clear mind. Having kind of mastered yourself to the extent that you can in the role that you're in, because you're going to take yourself wherever you go. And so, I think I just always think here's the place to start, no matter where you're at. And even if you're really good at a lot of these things, none of us are perfect. So there might be something still that you could add in. So you're very welcome. I see some thank yous here, and I appreciate that. And I want to thank you as well for your time today, for listening, for supporting each other, for taking care of yourselves, and for the difficult work that you do. And you can reach out anytime. Again, the phone number to schedule or to chat with any of us if you need something is 612-314-9169. And then the email address for scheduling is information@marieridgway.com. So please reach out if you ever need it, and take good care and stay safe.